Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Igor. Thank you, Nader, Elizabeth. I mean, it is true. This conference somehow started last year when, after many years not having really taught thesis, one thing that I actually have been doing for a while in other institutions, Nader asked me if actually I could come to Cooper to try to see how thesis actually was developed within this institution. Having not taught thesis for maybe 8 years, but having been in reviews probably on every single institution in this country that does teach thesis, I did have some questions about how does one teach thesis now, and what is an architectural thesis today? And it is true that running an institution like Storefront for Art and Architecture gives you a very clear sense of responsibility and urgency, if you want, to try to address some of the important issues that are happening within society. And if thesis is that space of inflection between that kind of disciplinary history that one inherits and the world outside that inhabits that present moment, it seemed to be pertinent to ask not only the students, but also to myself and to my colleagues, how does thesis stand now within the pedagogical project of an institution like Cooper, but also within all the other educational institutions that are engaged in that process? What is interesting about a symposium about thesis is that back in 2007, when I was a student doing my thesis at Princeton, GSAP already organized a symposium that was discussing thesis then, and issues of research, and issues of methodology. And I was an angry student, because I didn't think that actually we're addressing any of the urgencies of our time, or actually everything that was being discussed is something that we already knew. And I felt that I was yet again inside a room in which architects enjoyed very much talking about those pieces of history and comfort that archives had given them to try to repeat some platitudes. And so somehow I felt, what is thesis now? Of course, my thesis probably didn't even answer my question, but so this is why we have this symposium here today, and I'm grateful that having put the question there, together with Igor, of how do we go and organize a thesis symposium, I've been invited back now as if you want, as one of the participants. 2 weeks ago, I was in a symposium in a city in which all the heads of different schools around the world had been invited to discuss what pedagogies does each institution carry forward. You would assume that would have been a fabulous event in which all the different directors and heads of institutions really talk about what is that we teach, how do we teach, and where does one stand in relationship to the world. Well, the word thesis did not appear once. The words that appeared had to do with enrollment, tote bags, diplomas, ceremonies, and suddenly you realize that education has become an industry almost of numbers, in which the pedagogical project has somehow vanished. And one goes back and says, okay, what is thesis? And this has been my analysis, if you want, in terms of what is thesis? What does thesis stand for? Within an educational system that over the last, if you want, 20, 30 years has tried to resonate with a professional world, with systems of accreditation, with the spaces of measurability, right? Are we an institution that is accredited and recognized to be part of a profession that has liability, that actually has some responsibilities outside of these spaces of pedagogical protection? Thesis seems to be the ultimate resort in which an argument that actually tries to redefine those fundamental aspects that constitute our discipline as practice are allowed to. And so it seems that thesis is the space of redemption, that thesis is more something that also pedagogues want more than the students want. That in fact, something that we insist that needs to exist because we need to actually provide a space for ourselves to keep on pushing ideas forward. So one of the first things that I want to somehow put on the table is, who is thesis for? No, we have people who have been deans of a school, people who have been writing about pedagogies, people who have been teaching thesis, who have organized symposiums, who teach thesis in other institutions where I also have taught thesis. And so maybe the first question is, who is thesis for? And I think if we start talking maybe about that audience, no, and that audience today, we can start having a conversation. So Joan, if you would like to ask, who is thesis for?
Well, I found the last session really interesting. I'm sorry I missed most of the first session, but the microphone. As I've said, the last session was very interesting to me. The emphasis on narcissism, on individuality, on kind of this sort of voyage of discovery that the thesis student embarks on as part of the final year, a kind of culmination of the educational process. I mean, it's hard to say that the thesis is for anyone else unless it's for the archive, for the legacy of the school. I don't think it's for the faculty, the studio faculty. So it seems to be for the student. But I wanted to make a historical point. It's interesting, it's almost paradoxical that we're returning, or Cooper Union anyway, returning to this question of thesis now, given that in recent years, certainly over the last decade or more, there's been an emphasis on teamwork in architecture, on the kind of end of the auteur, or the great, master maker, form giver, ever since really postmodernism in the 80s. So at the Bauhaus, the final year, the absolute culmination of the Bauhaus education was not an individual project like a thesis. It was a collective work on a site where all the different workshops within the school got together and collaborated to produce something real in the world. The teaching of architecture did not even exist as such at the Bauhaus, at least at the beginning, in the Gropius years, and even through the Hannes Meyer, most of the Hannes Meyer period. So the culmination was not sort of becoming yourself, becoming, autobiographical, poetic, but rather working together for a great project. And of course, that model goes, all the way back to the Middle Ages and the Guild almost, where the building is a collaborative activity. So to now be talking about this moment in the student's education as the kind of crowning event is, as I say, I think paradoxical in relation to the collective notion that we have is more current today. But it is true that schools have identities, and one of the things I really wanted to react to again in the last session was a certain worry that we're becoming more homogeneous, that within the educational landscape, Cooper Union, at least since the Haydock moment, starting in the late 60s, or middle 60s, was emphasized a certain kind of autonomy, a certain kind of singularity on this island in the middle of the street where the building stood, that epitomized in a way a withdrawal from a larger context. And that was one of the things that made Cooper Cooper for a long time. My late husband, Bob Slutsky, used to say that a typical Cooper Union thesis was a house for a fisherman in the Gobi Desert. And that kind of project was, almost, epitomized what the idea was here, which was a kind of priesthood or monastery or something that was going on that was separated from what was outside. Again, it was paradoxical because all this evolves precisely at the moment in the 60s when all hell is breaking loose in the streets. The campuses are in an uproar, racial riots are going on in cities, assassinations are taking place, and students at Cooper, like little monks, are kind of practicing their craft. So in many ways, this place has been paradoxical with respect to the larger history, also existing in proximity to an art school, I think has given it a particular identity, especially at a moment when the trend was for architecture schools to be absorbed into university systems. So Cooper hasn't been that. So in any case, I think these are few historical considerations we throw out.
I mean, Stan, you were at the time when I was at Princeton dean, right? And Thesis was one of the very important spaces for that conversation and the production of an identity, if you want, as well. Maybe you could dovetail on what John...
Yeah, I mean, it is on, right? Is that working? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I also want to come back to your previous question, because I think it's a interesting provocation. And, you know, yes, Thesis is for the students, but I think Thesis has an enormous role in the construction of an institutional identity. It also, in part, because it's very much a public moment, right? It's the moment when you invite a lot of visiting critics. The students are asked to kind of perform in this kind of arena. I mean, I knew Princeton for, you know, all of the 10 or so years when I taught at Columbia, because I would come down there regularly to see the thesis work. So I think that it's true that Thesis serves in the kind of construction of an institutional identity. And I think that also has implications when we talk about the pedagogy around Princeton, that I have always said that as a teacher, all of the important stuff happens after the faculty go home and the students go up in the studio, and it's what they talk about with one another, it's what they look at on, you know, one time one another's drawing boards, and today on one another's screens, probably today on one another's social media feeds. You know, when a Cooper Union thesis got to 5th year, he or she had spent 4 years looking at thesis reviews and developing a kind of idea of what constituted a successful thesis. You know, Princeton, it's a shorter envelope, it's the same thing. I mean, by the time a student does thesis in 3rd year, they have 2.5 years of looking at projects. They develop an idea of what constitutes a successful thesis, which I think not much that we can say as faculty is going to change that. So I think it's important to understand, and this is, I think, partly the effect of looking at the archive, where you have this sort of decontextualized collection of work without understanding the dynamic of that process within each school that produces that work.
Andrew, if you would, I mean, there is something about, you were talking about the space, no? What happens when the students suddenly are left alone? And I was the other day looking into the budget of my new home, and I realized that we somehow have very similar lines to the salaries that we pay to the faculty or the academic staff, and the money that we invest in the buildings. And suddenly I realized that the building had to be teaching, no? That suddenly the building was teaching silently, like 24 hours, and the GSD is a space in which there is a very clear hierarchy, no? Like you start in the bottom and you finish on the top, and you ascend into the angels, and interestingly enough, going through the different kind of cliches or identities of what constitutes a thesis at Cooper or at Princeton or at Harvard, there are particular ideas of what constitutes a more of a professional, corporate, critical, poetic. Harvard has been changing. I mean, Ed Eigen arrived, he was actually coordinating thesis for a few years, and yet there is a kind of still a very strong preconception about what thesis at the GSD might be. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Sure.
And who is the thesis at GSD?
Yeah. I also, like Stan, want to return to your first question, who is it for? But maybe just to articulate the preconception about GSD's thesis, which is that it's sort of competence directed, that we are interested in producing practitioners sort of at the highest level, and thesis, or at least the kind of caricature of Harvard's thesis, is that it is exclusively sort of directed to those ends. I don't know that that's the way it functions in practice, and maybe as a kind of roundabout way of describing the way it is now, I'll return to your question and say, Who is Thesis for? Well, it's for students, but insofar as it allows them to confront the institution's agenda for them on a more or less equal footing for the first time. So it's interesting to me that you would characterize yourself as a kind of angry thesis student, and I think that's of consequence because thesis is the moment when you actually get to kind of punch back in some way and articulate a counter agenda. So what's happening at Harvard now? I think the space of the trays is important. That's the kind of giant cascade of sort of mega stair steps that everyone works on under one big roof. I'm seeing a kind of interest in students framing their agendas as being a collective enterprise, and that's been articulated many times today. However, what's perhaps more interesting is the way in which they do that. So I see a kind of flight to what I would call the micro-interest. So we have recent theses on transfer slabs in Hong Kong, one on the movie Fitzgeraldo, one on tchotchkes, one on CNC milling bent alderwood. And so all of these, like, how do we square the kind of proliferation of the micro-interest against the self-professed ambition to kind of hold a collective enterprise? Well, micro-ambitions play nicely together. In fact, they are kind of nice by definition. None of them stake out territory that comes at the cost of another. They all image beautifully, and they all produce a kind of a clear set of expertises that can be sort of unspooled and researched over time. And so I would say my task has been to sort of demand that those micro-interests actually all in the end be targeted at the building. Because in a way now, Harvard's insistence on competence and practice is sort of radical when paired with the proliferation of the kind of micro-interest or the micro-agenda.
When I was at Rice, that was like, I would say, last gesture of Lars Lerup. Before he left the school, he asked me to direct thesis for the master program when Albert Poe was on a sabbatical, and I thought that was pretty brave. And I have to thank him for that. And I think that's how important it is for deans to take risks. And I know that Nader also does take risks, and how great is that. But so some of the changes, if you want, that have happened since Sarah has arrived. Obviously, now thesis has become optional, right? In some way, like thesis was something that everyone was supposed to do, everyone had to excel at in order to graduate, and now suddenly there has been a shift in there. Maybe you could talk a bit about suddenly when something becomes optional, there is a shift.
Yeah. Yes. I'm glad you asked me about that because I wanted to clarify Igor's introduction. The thesis semester in terms of the design thesis semester is optional. Proposing a thesis project is not optional. And we certainly think it's important that every student goes through, at the end of their time at Rice, an opportunity to formulate their take on what they've received there, on their ambition and interest and passion with respect to the field before they go out into the world. And I think that's one of the values. So I do think the thesis is for students in that respect.
Who chooses who makes one and who doesn't?
Yeah, so what happens is that the students make a thesis proposal, and they're all required to do that. And then there's a process of finding an advisor. So they solicit for advisors, and if they don't get an advisor, they don't do a thesis. If some of them also opt out and just decide that they don't want to do the design thesis semester, so that's the way it works. So I want to stress it's not as it sounded a little bit anti-disciplinary before, and it couldn't be more distant from that. I guess I also wanted to talk about the first question you asked, and I think it's absolutely for the students, but I also think it's for the faculty. I think the discussion that we've had today has really shown, I think, that thesis, in a sense, spurs or provokes the discourse about epistemology in a School of Architecture, what counts as knowledge, what kinds of methodologies are there, etc. And so I think that the discourse that takes place around thesis is really fundamental. And that's why one of the main reasons I think we should keep thesis, and it's important, is because I think it does provoke that discourse. I think perhaps more in Rice because there's a smaller school, and that's more possible because we can all be involved in those conversations. But I also think, just to add one more thing to that, is I think we very much talk about thesis as a curriculum-wide thing, and so it doesn't begin at the moment you step into pre-thesis, but it begins at the moment you step in the door. And that a student is being prepared for thesis in their history theory classes, in their design studios, in the seminars. And in a sense, it gives them the opportunity to respond to that pedagogy. And in a sense, provides a kind of mirror back to us, I think, about what we've given them or what we haven't given them, our shortcomings and our successes. And so I think we find that moment at the end of their career, or at the end of their pedagogy, a very important one in a kind of reflective moment for us.
Can I jump in with an example, again, of the broader impact of thesis? One of the things we did at Princeton, I don't know, probably 10 or 12 years ago now, when Liz Diller took it over, was the creation of a kind of one-word theme that would hopefully give some sort of unity to all the disparate projects. And I will say, quite honestly, I don't think it's made a lot of difference to the projects themselves, but it's actually served to focus the discussion at thesis reviews. So, again, one of the jobs of thesis is to produce this public discourse around problems in the discipline, and I think that's a big role.
I mean, before we actually jump into this room, like Cristina and I, in a certain way, like I feel that we made a pas de baton, no? Like now she's running thesis together with Farzin. We were talking about sometimes one encounters projects that make one hesitate and doubt, is this a thesis project, no? One of my big fights, if you want, at Rice in my last year, is when someone would sit in the jury row and would say, this is not an architectural thesis. And I would argue back, this is undeniably an architectural problem, and it is an architectural thesis. And so this idea of disciplinarity and what constitutes an architectural thesis, something that is interesting, again, in that so-called conference that was 2 weeks ago in China, one of the lecturers, actually a Chinese scholar, said, disciplinarity in Chinese doesn't exist as such. You cannot translate it. Discipline can be translated as prison, as punishment, Spain, and he went through all kind of different words, and I loved it, because in fact, this kind of illusion that there is a disciplinary argument around what constitutes architecture and what doesn't is a very recent fiction that we all in this coast, or if you want in this American context, have subscribed religiously to actually exorcise I don't know who out of it. And so the question here goes back to Cristina, because as someone who has been pushing the discipline in so many different directions, if we can now afford even to use that term, I think Cooper, having houses for fishermen in the Gobi Desert, is a place in which one pushes that limit quite often. Maybe you can talk a bit about your experience doing thesis and through many different schools, but also what is happening right now at Cooper.
Okay. Well, one thing that is obvious and more obvious than anywhere else in Cooper is that thesis is this perfect place to question somehow paradigms in architectural education and architectural practice. No, one thing that is really beautiful, again, in thesis in some places, but especially here, I would say, is that. Thesis is a space for resistance, if you want, no? So it's, I mean, thesis students are at this beautiful age where they have to somehow show all the skills that they have acquired during all these years, but also they could, and maybe they should, show some healthy academic disrespect and some healthy disrespect in terms of the practice as well, no? And of course, this brings many other issues, no? One of the main critics of that happened in '68 and architectural education, for example, was that, of course, the students and some faculty was vindicating that we should be talking about relevant issues of the time at that time, right? That was something that we vindicate, Farzin and I, today in thesis as well, no? But that one thing that happened afterwards and that resonates topics today as well, is that this somehow led to the idea that university studies should lead to giving solutions and towards the end of humanities, if you want. So it's like the question is very broad, no? So I think that we try somehow to keep this space as a space of experimentation, if you want, and where the students should really take risk. I would say that we try to do like an exercise of seeing, and I like this quote by David Foster Wallace in This is Water, where he says that university studies are interesting because they teach you, if you're a fish, what is water, no? Which is like, sometimes the issues that are in front of you are the most difficult to talk, but also it's an exercise of hearing, because hearing, as it was mentioned in the last panel as well, is like a political act, if you want, no? So hearing could be listening, has a responsibility, but also we somehow tell the students to make a mark, no? With a thesis always, no? And a mark in grammar is a punctuation. You mark, you say something about something else, but in sound it's also to mask something that is happening, right? And we do the other way. We do it the other way around. Instead of masking, we want the student to unveil issues and don't show good intentions, and always try to make us think instead of giving solutions.
When we started today this conference, Igor actually showed us 47 pages that somehow were an attempt to produce a pedagogical structure, a syllabus. I mean, you guys know, last year I was calling you, we were having Skype conversations, what are the references, what are the precedents that we have to be able to understand. I remember when we were at Princeton, the famous matrix in which one situates oneself and positions in relationship to many other issues. And for me, what was interesting when I tried to produce this syllabus in which I asked Anna Miliak at MIT, I mean, really did almost like call and reach out to absolutely everyone. I was very interested in the archive, and Steve is there, in how do we archive thesis projects, no? And I'm very interested in the idea of like metadata, like how does one find things, and how do you identify that a project is not a studio project, no? That it is not a theme-based project, that is actually something that has a particular new ground and idiosyncratic space in which tries to formulate a new idea. And so with this idea of like trying to create its own metadata or kind of a methodology for itself, we produced these 13 points that somehow were important to address or to somehow look for in any thesis. And for me it was a way to help the students. I always say, I'm a midwife, no? If there is a thesis in you, I'm going to have you pull it out. And so it's going to be painful, but the real trick is that I'm going to be asking for very specific questions that if you have a thesis, is going to help you articulate and find reference points so it becomes evident. There is something incredible about American academia in comparison to the polytechnic systems in Europe, in which when one enters into the walls of a school, one is believed to actually have the privilege, if you want, to become an architect. It is our responsibility as pedagogues to actually find the architect within each one of those individuals or collectives that one encounters, and not the other way around. That the thesis in the European context is a demonstration that you have acquired the skills necessary to show the proficiency within a field, yeah? And so the first one was the idea of the statement, no? Manifesto, articulating your idea and through words. Second one was location. Where do you stand? Where do you situate yourself? And the idea of location in a world in which we are becoming more global, no? In which we all have collective aspirations, where there is a kind of a cosmopolitan understanding of architectural discourse. How do we understand a particular location and the importance of that location in the formulation of ideas? The third point was temporality. How far does this project come in its past and how far it's going into the future? Scales. What, again, mad powers of 10, unveiling power structures, something that sometimes as architects we just leave it as a site. The users, who is inhabiting it? Is it humans, is it plants, is it microbes? Energy. Bringing what Caroline was talking before about sustainability. Energy goes beyond that, but to me I think has become one of the fundamental elements. So if one was to create a kind of like metadata set for thesis, these are like points that I think would be important. Platform. What is the platform by which a thesis gets communicated? Is it a blog? Is it a publication? Is it the boards in the exhibition of the final review? somehow we always believe that the thesis is always ends in the day of the presentation. And then we say, no, it's going to haunt you the entire life. But we do have platforms of dissemination of knowledge that go beyond that. Point number 9, who are the critics and the agents that actually should participate in that thesis? And the idea is that who are the critics is Tony. We had the privilege last year to have Anthony Vidler as the kind of the third leg in that thesis development. Is Tony the ultimate critic for all theses? Or is somehow the guy who's walking down the street the ultimate critic in all theses? Number 10 was typology. And I think that was a very difficult one. Is typology one of the essential elements that in architecture actually constitutes a space of reference against ways to situate ourselves? Vocabulary. Number 12 was presentation, performance. We all know that a thesis is always an act of communicating. It's an act of presenting. There is no thesis without that half an hour, 10 minutes that a student is given to communicate. And ultimately representation. No? But so those 13 points to me were a way to try to help the student to, if you answer each one of these 13 points, you have a thesis. And somehow, I'm not sure that I totally succeeded, but somehow I would like to ask you, what are the points that for you are essential for the development of a thesis? And this goes back to methodology, because for me this was a method. Yeah, this was not about content necessarily. It was it's like a Socratic process. You ask a question, hoping that the answer is going to make something evident. And maybe, Joan, you could talk a bit more about different methods by which one actually allows one to position oneself in architecture.
Well, I think all the questions are great questions, Eva, but what they do, what it suggests to me is how much the thesis has changed here at Cooper, because those were not the questions that were put to students back in the 70s and the 80s. The pedagogical method was more one of osmosis. It wasn't indoctrination. I would disagree with the way it was characterized a little bit by one of the speakers in the last session. It was a kind of softer transmission of an ideology or a discourse. But I think by forcing these issues today, posing the questions and requiring an actual thesis, and the very word thesis, I think, is significant in itself. So a thesis is not a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a supposition or a conjecture. It's something that maybe you start out with. But a thesis is a proposition. It's an assertion. It's a position. And I actually went and looked at the etymology of the word, which comes from Greek and then through Latin. And the word thesis comes from the verb to place a thing out there. A thing laid down would be a pretty literal etymology, which is quite fascinating from the standpoint of our discipline, because I know what a thesis is when we're dealing with, architectural history or, some other intellectual field. But again, we're all struggling with this question of what a design thesis is and how research plays into it and so on. But this idea of making a positive postulation, taking a position, standing on and for something, seems to me a very 21st century way of approaching a thesis now, and different from the tradition, at least as it's been in this place. So I think those questions sound absolutely apropos.
Stan, I remember once you saying, if everything can happen, nothing will happen. And so, in a certain way, trying to make a list of things that should happen, no, in order that ultimately something can happen. I would be very interested. There was when the projective that was brought into the room before, but this idea of project versus practice, no, the idea of the studio, because I still believe that least provocation of one word could be a studio, right? And one could assume so that in fact a good school makes that every single class, as you were mentioning before, is a thesis, no? That the writing and the teaching of history is a thesis. That every single studio is a thesis space. But maybe I'm very interested in what are the what is a constraint too much? No, like, because in each one of these 13 questions, everything fits, right? But there is not a theme that changes every year.
No, you're absolutely correct. But I think the other thing that has changed historically is there used to be a greater distance between studio and thesis. I think I think I should confess, I'm a bit of a thesis skeptic. Partly I'm a thesis skeptic because I wonder if, the capacities for independent thinking, for taking a stand and defending it, constructing arguments, that's something we ask students to do in almost all upper level studios. And so I think what was perhaps once a difference in kind has become a kind of gradual difference, that you simply, you ask the student to take more responsibility for those issues in the context of thesis, but you've already asked the student to take that kind of responsibility over the course of a number of different studios. I'm a little suspicious of a kind of checklist. I agree with Joan, those are all the right questions to answer, but I think, again, one of the things we, for better or worse, ask the students to do over the course of a thesis is to invent his or her own methodology. And again, I mean, if the field is too wide open and students don't have some markers, it's going to be difficult. I tend to frame it in a slightly simpler way. For me, a successful thesis is one which takes a problem in the world and a problem in the discipline and puts them together in a kind of productive way. And I think you can also use that sort of forensically, that theses that fail often fail because they're too focused on a problem in the world, or they're too focused on a problem in they're too focused on a problem in the world, and they try and take on, I don't know, kind of solve the European refugee crisis through architecture. The European refugee crisis has something to do with architecture. Architecture is probably implicated in that, but the forces that have created the European refugee crisis are large political and economic realities that architecture doesn't have a lot of traction with. Conversely, and maybe this speaks to some of the critiques in the morning, a thesis which is too narrowly focused on the discipline has no traction in the world. So that's my sort of slightly simpler formulation.
One of the things that I don't think happens at the GSD necessarily is the student that might show up and say, I grew up in a rice village, and exactly, that's another rice village. Going back to the idea of, it's not necessarily like, and goes back not necessarily to the pedagogy, but into the idea of the I think it was articulated through ideas of narcissistic approaches, but the idea of the biographic, or the idea of the author, of the ideas, where does one take sources for architectural form, or where does one actually try to find a position? Most of the times when a student is confronted to find a position, where do you stand? Suddenly they retrieve, in their kind of ancestral place of origins, like home. And it's a very strange phenomenon that I have encountered too many times, because you would expect that when you ask them, like, find a position, they would be able to go out there into the world and find a position that either ideologically, if you want, in a kind of disciplinary way, they are able to articulate. But so, what are those things that, in a certain, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are certain things that do not happen at Harvard. Right. Why?
Yeah. So I think there is for a long time there was a sort of unwritten no solipsism code that I think I would credit Ed Eigen correctly with formalizing as a series of strictures. And so I'm going to forget them, but they go something like no theses in your hometown, no theses about your own sort of identity group. But it's not that there is a problem per se with thesis as the projection of the self. It's just kind of like an over-identification of thesis with like very simplistic markers of identity that makes it just frankly boring. And so in any case, simple answer to your question, I think Ed did some pretty elegant housekeeping, so I don't have to deal with that problem anymore. It's just like widely understood. Don't put it in your hometown, don't make it about yourself. I think maybe our formulation for a recipe, sort of on the scale of complexity, is somewhere between the two poles. Like, we're not quite as elegant as Stan's formulation. We have a fewer points than the 13. But maybe for us, it's also sort of divided between like points to guide research and points to sort of convert research into some kind of outcome. So research for us has to do with bracketing precedent, let's say, that could be extra architectural, and then finding an ideological position. And then in the conversion to the actual sort of design product, we come up with essentially the ingredients for a building that you never have to interpret as necessarily being a building. So, for instance, context or site. That could be down the street. It could also be a kind of historical framing. And we would add to that constituency, organization, and envelope. So all of these terms that are convenient for the purposes of making a very sort of primitive construction of a building, but also sort of float nicely in a kind of wider construction of the discipline.
It's funny because I remember once I was at the GSD on a thesis review, and the project was discussed on questions of envelope, facade, form, and at the end of the thesis, I looked to the student who was wearing a suit and a tie, and I said, you know, if you were not wearing a suit and a tie, I really would think that you're an activist trying to actually just serve the homeless and try to produce a kind of a housing, informal housing structure for them. And you could see a smile on the student that was going from ear to ear. He looks to his thesis advisor, and his thesis advisor, somehow there's well, that's where he started. So somehow he was forced to go very much away from his social motivation to produce an architectural project that at the end somehow was really truly serving the initial do-good purpose of the project itself. There is something about the idea of research and search, and I know, John, you have been talking a lot over this the last few years, but these last 2 weeks, I've been having a lot of conversations about pedagogies and pedagogical projects, and we have been also start to talk about the idea of study, and the idea that, in fact, the idea of research, and we have been doing research for a really long time, and we call research things that, of course, people within the university system or the scientific structures would raise eyebrows to us. And so the question here is, how do we think in terms of methods and methodology and questions of I think there is something that has to do more, not so much with research, but what I call maybe speculation. No? And so, are there other terms? What is that we do when we actually try to produce a thesis? Because in a certain way, we are highly superficial sometimes in the engagement of either philosophical, historical, technical elements, even economic constraints or theories. So I'm very interested in trying to, if we were not going to do research, if that's what we actually describe as research, we say we cannot use research anymore because that actually has a certain forms of measurement, it has a certain scientific method and whatnot. Do we speculate more than we do research? Do we study more than we do research? I would like you to actually position yourselves in what is that we do when we do a thesis? Do we research? Do we study? Do we speculate? Do we fictionalize? I always say, to students, even if you're doing a thesis in your hometown, just say it's not your hometown. No? And so, but what is that we do as architects? I think maybe we should find a new word. Scott.
Find a new word.
Now.
Thanks for sending this one to me, Eva. I think what we're doing, research is probably a bad word because it tries, I think, to capture what we're doing for people outside of the field. I think we're just trying to be self-conscious and intelligent about what we do in terms of architectural practice. I guess I'd go back to Stan's essay that you mentioned before, from 20 years ago, the project versus practice essay, where it seems to me that it was pretty clearly said there that, well, at least my interpretation of the essay is that in a sense what we're concerned about is the design of design, or being smart about what design is. And I think for me that's partly what we're doing. I don't know that I can do better than that, frankly.
Cristina, you have been an agitator. You have, in a certain way, the idea of agonism, no, I think is something that maybe is better than research. And you have been doing a lot of all of those things. So maybe you could help us differentiate and push ourselves in understanding what is that we do in different moments in our careers, when we do a PhD and we do research, when we do a thesis,
I think that it's very difficult to make a generalization. No, one thing that I think in terms of research is that in different architectural arenas, I think that maybe we waste too much time trying to find what is the meaning of architectural research. One of the things that I find very often is that research is not the gathering of information. I mean, what we try to do is somehow to look for being extremely refined in what we do and very precise. No, the search for precision should be more linked to research, I would say. No, but in terms of your question, and also in terms of this idea of what a thesis should be in those terms as well. I mean, I can put you an example of what we're doing, Farsin and I, in this class too. No, I think that not explicitly we have, at least at the very beginning, like the launching of the class, this exercise of again, no explicit, no anti-narcissism, because that's very difficult in our field, but maybe anti-self-obsession and maybe anti-nostalgia, if you want, which is that we throw the students in the first week in a super intensive exercise of scan of what are the current conversations in architecture in all the biennials and triennials of the last 4 years, let's say. So they become experts in what is going on in the world for the last 4 or 5 years, and then they have to find a reflection locally as well. And that is the launching point. And then they find like a critical position in terms of that, and they start develop their own obsessions within that framework. And in terms of agonism, if you say, I think that is good exercise. But that, in combination also with an exercise of cutting brain circuits, if you want, doing these other exercises where they will find randomly other issues and methods as well. Okay, so these two combine and goes to this delirium. They're looking at me like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd like to respond on the research thing because it's been a hobby horse of mine recently. So this word research, it's like a fetish word. It's like a safe conduct pass in most architecture schools. If you're doing research, you're doing good. And this is a problem I find. In fact, what I've argued is that what used to be known as history/theory has turned into research/curation today. And it's not an accident that we're so obsessed with research, because research is very much involving skills of gathering information, lots of data, the kind of accumulation of information. And then what do you do with that? You arrange it. That's the curating part. You find the best way to display it, and of course architects are great at doing that. But meanwhile, it's also connected, I think, to a present cultural moment that we're in, and I think it's dangerous. It's interesting, you know, that Le Corbusier's book, Creation is a Patient Search, that the translator chose to translate recherche as search in English, and I think you know, that was a nice choice. Actually, this goes back. But research originally in architecture does come from the polytechnical model of education that becomes dominant in both Europe and the United States in the 19th century. And of course, at that moment, it's at a moment when architecture is being taught as part of engineering. It's architectural engineering, in fact. And research means things like, you know, doing a deep study of acoustics in relation to architecture. But I think in our day, you know, in our kind of consumer capitalist moment, research has other implications, and that's why I think it's kind of toxic when we are talking about a kind of authentic engagement with knowledge and ideas and the production of some thought that is new and useful and is contributing something to the field. So against research here.
No, in fact, yeah, I'm not sure how to, there's another mic up here, but anyway, I mean, look, I think you actually gave the answer in the question, and I have a lot of influential educators here. Can we just agree going forward to say study instead of research? I mean, don't tell a student go out and research that problem. Say, go out and study that problem. I think it's actually a brilliant word choice. So, you know, let's just agree going forward. Because I agree totally with Joan. The other thing I would say is that the details of structure make a lot of are actually, they make a lot of difference, and they are very important. That we don't talk about that much. How many reviews? How are the reviews structured? What's the expectation for each of the reviews? The number of advisors. Again, even for the people who are looking at the archive, the fact that Cooper Union had multiple advisors as opposed to a single advisor, that made a huge difference. And I don't know if that's the case anymore, but it's important to pay attention to those things. Also, the length of the project. Am I remembering incorrectly? But thesis at Cooper is a year long, which is completely different than a one-semester thesis. And even, you know, actually, if I can turn the tables, if Eva could talk a little bit about the diploma studio as a potential counter model to the thesis in its US context.
Thanks for the you know, I love thesis. I've been teaching thesis, and somehow suddenly now I jump into a school that doesn't have thesis. And so the first thing that you look is like, where is thesis? No, it's like, why the AA doesn't have thesis? And of course you look into the diploma studios and diploma units that are a year long, but then you also find the intermediate units that also are a year long. And you start realizing, so what I spent the last 4 months is actually reading a lot into external examiners' reports, people who actually, so talking about the reviews, no? The way in which the reviews are structured at the AA actually is essential part of the pedagogical structure, because you are not measured by necessarily the people who have been teaching you, but actually by a group of external examiners that come to listen and to assess what is that you have done in relationship to the framework that you have been given. But what has been interesting is, like, some of the comments in the people who are in the second year is, students are given too much freedom to formulate their briefs. The responsibility is probably bigger than their ability to respond. But what happens is that at the AA, students from the second year onwards, they are doing thesis in every single year. The second year, the third year, the fourth year, the fifth year, they engage with a year-long project in which they study certain subject matters in the first, and I'm like, okay, it's not that I went to a school that has no thesis at all, it's that absolutely every single unit of design is a thesis. And so I am now learning to try to identify where that exists and resides, but it is true that in the diploma units, especially the students in the fifth year, they always choose units that allow them a higher level of freedom, but somehow everyone is already training every student from the second year onwards to really confront themselves with that void, if you want, or that space that at Princeton identified as an anxiety abyss. No, the thesis was that the space in which people were crying sometimes or taking anxiolytics and so on. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So it's really, for me, I'm still learning and figuring out how does the do it. But what is also interesting is that there is a thesis written component, something that in the US we have somehow lost. So that when someone, after their 5 years of education, they identify that there is a piece of text that should be able to reflect the ideas that are being developed within either a design unit or a design studio in a kind of different temporality or in a different context. And I think that's also good. I mean, the idea of writing something longer than tweets or Instagram hashtags is something that I'm very much in favor of. But so I think the AA is something I'm still learning. Even if now I'm directing it, it's something that I'm just trying to understand. But it has to do with how do we, as a discipline, and I probably we need to open up the question to the audience, is how do we, many of the important questions, if you want, within architecture education are timeless, right? How do we want to live together is probably the basic one. And that somehow we use the word before, utopia, and I said, there has been so many moments in which that word has been used as a despective answer to a thesis project that was somehow too easily producing an idea of how we want to live together without actually offering a kind of precise criticism. And I always said I always miss the word ideotopia, no? The place of ideals, that should be, as dystopia, the kind of like despective space to liberate utopia from its critical edge. But so, there are some of these very important questions that sometimes we forget to ask. That is, how does each one of those theses help us answer some of the very simple questions, no? How is that going to change the world in some way for the better? And those kind of naive questions or platitudes are things that we don't know how to ask sometimes in a sophisticated manner. So, putting the level, if you want, to that basic line, I would like to open the questions to the floor, to somehow bring together the pedagogies, the idea of research, but also the idea of agency, no? Into the forefront, so that we can all have a conversation about what is thesis now? How do we deal with some of those famous words that are around these days, questions of truth or post-truth or authenticity? New generations are interested in being authentic, something that in architecture we could not have used, like saying we want to be authentic, like people would have thrown us out of the school. But these days actually something that new generations are interested in talking. So, thesis now, questions. We have a question there. And can we get a microphone? There's one. Yeah. One.
Hi. I'm really wondering how you start to distinguish between an undergrad thesis and a thesis. I'm wondering how you start to distinguish between an undergrad thesis and a thesis, because I think although all of the topics and points within the topic that we're talking about today are fascinating, they're sort of conflated, and I think it's nebulous what the undergrad student might bring and what a thesis student might bring as far as informing their own pedagogy, their own methodology in coming to a topic that they're interested in studying, not researching.
I'm uniquely fortunate in that I don't have that problem. We only have grad students, so it doesn't apply to us. Yeah.
We only have a graduate thesis, but we often think, because we have the BARC program, and we have them for 5 years, and so in a sense I feel like we prepare them for 5 years, why don't we give them a thesis, whereas we're giving a thesis to students that we've inherited and we've had, a year and a half before they're in pre-thesis. So I think it's an interesting question.
I mean, as someone who has done an undergraduate thesis and a graduate thesis, and I like to think that all the work that I was doing at the storefront was a thesis, it's very strange, the sense of innovation, if you want, that we have in architecture. In other fields, mathematician, usually they always say that any breakthrough will happen before they are actually 23 years of age, right? In architecture, we believe that only genius moments occur after you are 60. And so the kind of distinction between those two modalities, I think it's of what constitutes innovation and contribution to a field. I always have it here as a question mark. I have to say that I think there is no distinction. I do think that sometimes undergraduates have a better knowledge of the field because they have gone through like 4 or 5 years, so they can ask questions that if we actually again were to use the idea of disciplinarity as a space of intervention, I think they can be more precise in making that connection. But also at the graduate level, you have people who are much more mature that actually bring other fields within their own baggage and are able to actually make connections in another level. So for me, at the end, I think theses, you could find theses in the undergraduate level or at the graduate level that are equally radical or significant in their contribution to the field, but coming from very different spaces. And I have seen fabulous theses in the undergrad and fabulous theses in the grad. So I don't think there is such a difference. I think that it's just simply the form of expertise is different.
Can I say something to that? Yeah, I completely agree. I was going to say something very similar. No, but you pointed out something that I was going to talk a little bit about as well, which is the idea of innovation, no? And this is something that it runs through every panel and in every class and in every exhibition and in the architectural culture in general, no? And I think that we have to be somehow careful, because it seems that if someone proposes something that sounds new in a thesis, for example, it seems that then it's valid up to a certain extent. I mean, if it's also correct, if it's also excellent in terms of the execution, etc. No, but it seems also that now the new, it's like a justification for everything, as before was collaboration, as before was the green, for example, these kinds of things as well. No, I mean, one quote that I like as well, it's from Chantal Mouffe, that said that we can, if we want to create some sort of resistance of any kind in political matters, in architectural matters, in art matters, we can't just act as the avant-garde from the 20th century or the 60s, where we just say no to something and then propose something new. If we propose something new, it could happen, two things could happen. One is that the market, let's say, will absorb it immediately, therefore it doesn't have a lot of effect, but also is that, I mean, it's just, it could be just a justification for something else. So I think that in terms of the thesis, for instance, this is something that I like to throw on top of the table, to be aware so that it doesn't become just one of the pillars of innovation, one of the pillars of the how good or bad a thesis is, no? Masters or undergrad?
I wasn't saying how good or bad it was. I was just asking about the difference.
Yeah. There is another question over there. It was something, if you want, that the other day I encountered, and I said to someone, what are the projects that you are developing? And they said, we are only engaging in projects that are going to affect more than 100,000 people. Yeah? So now let's imagine that thesis at Princeton is just dealing with projects or theses that are going to affect more than 100,000 people. And as an idea, I found it totally radical, right? Because suddenly you don't need to say you don't do it in your hometown, you don't do it, it's not blue, it's not pink, it's not this typology, it's not, no. It's the idea of agency. And at the beginning I wanted to have the panel agency, because that's one that I'm really interested in. It's like, how do we really have an impact out there, yeah? And so the idea that actually you just do projects that are able to affect more than 100,000 people, it's like, what is worth, no? And so, no, the idea of elitism, no? And you say, no, I'm going to do something that's going to affect 10 people on planet Earth, especially those ones living in luxury yachts. Oh, is that a valid thesis? No, and like, what are those ethical lines? Is something that somehow I was reflecting. Did the microphone make it to the question? Yes, there we go.
So I guess going right along with your last comment, I think that one thing that I've kept thinking about today is that all of these methodologies and, let's say, explanations of the process of thesis seem to be dependent, or even when we say take a position on what is very, very dependent on the presumption that students care about the world, which is a very, very strong supposition to have, that students will care and care a lot and care deeply about something. And I guess my question about this would be that, and specifically to the word of narcissism, which I think that narcissism by any other name might be a very specific kind of self-care or self-love, right? And that doesn't seem to be enough for architecture, or the kind of exploration, let's say, of a psychosis seems to be not enough for a thesis. And so it seems that for a thesis, it's not enough to simply care or to love a thing. In fact, there needs to be, alongside this kind of invested care for something, a kind of clinical ability to tear it apart, to reconfigure, to reconstruct, and to propose something. Which means that you can't care too much. And so I guess my question would be, alongside the way that we are educated in architecture, how much is architecture education still about teaching students how to care about specific things in the world, or why to care? And when you get to that moment in thesis, when you are at once supposed to care and not care in the perfect way, how do we still position a thesis as being able to do architecture badly. I think I'm struck by this idea that architecture seems to be somewhere stuck in this crisis between the sciences and the humanities, which to me is like the perfect kind of, let's say the perfect situation of a Frankenstein, which is science gone wrong or science done badly when you love a thing too much. And there's this weird kind of, let's say, moment where methodology is abused or used in the wrong way. So a very convoluted way of asking, how much is architecture about, or architecture education still dependent on teaching students how to care?
There's a show that I like. I don't know if this is really a direct answer to your question, but I think about it a lot in connection with Thesis. It's Jerry Seinfeld. It's called Comedians in Cars Going to Get Coffee or something like that, right? And they sit around in a fancy car and they go and get coffee, and it's two comedians, and they're talking about their work as comedians, and they're telling jokes to each other. So it's a kind of, at once a kind of practice, but also a kind of discourse, because they're also kind of analysing each other. And they care deeply. They have an absolute passion for what they do. And I think we are asking you to have a passion for what you do. But I think we're also asking for you to, the part you described as a kind of, how am I supposed to have a kind of distance from that passion, I think is the part where Jerry Seinfeld says, yeah, I like the way you tell jokes like Richard Pryor or something, right? It's to understand, I think, how your passion relates to the work of the field that's gone before you. And thank goodness that they do that, because I think comedians tell better jokes for having discussions about comedy in cars. And then I think your characterization at the end of your question, I think, was about, I think you were describing a particular kind of thesis, I think. I mean, there was a discussion earlier about hyperbole. I think that's a very particular kind of thesis. I think that's a thesis that's perhaps, well, we often call it a thesis that's kind of pointing to an issue or by exaggerating it, or I think that's probably a different thing than imagining that the disciplinary discussion actually tells better jokes, if that makes sense. And I think that's a very different kind of thesis than actually just kind of explicating the issue. And so I think that's an answer, I hope.
Yeah. So I just wanted to jump in and say, like, I'm a little bit nervous about placing a discussion about care for the world adjacent to a discussion about scale of effect. That seems a little like totalitarianism is one answer to that equation. So I don't know that those are necessary partners. And let me just say that I observe a kind of interesting parallel between that adjacency and maybe some of the critique of research, in that both seem to be in search of an almost performative, or let's say measurable, model for architecture's agencies having effects. And so maybe just to dissent a tiny bit from the critique of research, it's come under the following pressure, as I would kind of characterize it, both by Arendam and then also this panel, where research and the kind of contemporary mood of curation and organizing and gathering avoids the production of new knowledges that would be in some sense measurable, in the acoustical terms, quantitatively measurable. I'm not certain at what point those kinds of performances actually drift into extradisciplinary territory, and when we might want to call an engineer to provide the answer. One of the virtues of this, the kind of collector-curator model of contemporary research, is that it's always in search of models that originated in one place, which can be sort of delaminated and re-originated in another, which is one way of describing the kind of continual work of the architect. And so I have in mind here everything from the enfilade organization of rooms at the King's Apartments in Versailles, which are a kind of cosmology, to Vitcover's kind of extended analogy between the way musical scales work and a kind of proportioning system in architecture. Those aren't, we cannot evaluate those in terms of performances, but we can in terms of the kind of convenience of analogy between disparate sets of knowledges. And maybe that's also an okay thing for architects to be up to.
Well, I mean, I agree completely, but why not just call it collecting and curating and not call it research? I think that, I think the term is loaded.
There is something that I think I would love to add into that. I mean, the idea of measuring, no, and measurables, and maybe also answering to the fact that ethics. No, I remember when I was a student in the School of Architecture in the Polytechnic system, there was a class that was called aesthetics, that was taught by philosophers. But mostly what you were being taught were about the ethical, moral implications in the history of art, architecture, and thought. And somehow those things now disappeared from the Polytechnic model, but also in, if you want, the American university system, you find them in the adjacent schools, no? How do we educate better citizens? How do we make people be more aware of their own ethical responsibilities? I think that's something that architecture education has not been looking at, right? I think the truth is that a lot of the conversations that I'm having with my academic staff is the idea of like decolonizing architectural knowledge and the responsibility that we have to tell different kind of histories. And those histories actually go aligned with questions of ethics, and they go aligned with questions of responsibility. And so the moment in which we are able to talk about architectural history, not on those terms that we thought we were disciplinary issues, that now we realize that were egocentric formulations, now that we actually need to write maybe new canonical histories, then we might be able to have architectural conversations that are able to at least understand the limitations of what we can and we cannot do as architects. But I find it problematic when one actually is at least unable to even confront the ethical and, if you want, political implications of everything that we do before. I mean, this morning we had some images and we had some conversations like, but everything is political and this thing is political and it's fine. And you're like, yeah, but how so? And how dangerously is this actually making a before and after? And I think it's very important to understand the idea of precision and how do we situate ourselves within that. One of the strange things when one goes through a process that is called third degree awarding powers that I'm going through now is that they ask you for learning outcomes. They ask you, what is that people are going to learn after they finish the 5th year? And you're like, learning outcomes. What is that I can say that people, and how do you, and then they ask you, and how do you measure it? You're like, okay. And then they have something that's called KPIs, that is like key performance indicators. And you're like, And so I'm very good at bureaucracy, as you all can imagine. And so I find fantastic KPIs. But so I think we need to produce a very kind of like new space of like formulating what is that we really want architecture to be talking about, and what is that we believe and can understand that architecture has done. And I do think that there is a task for all of us that is to rewrite those kind of histories that we have inherited, that sometimes just somehow produce a form of fabulous narrative entertainment, that it is great and valid, but I think it needs a bit of a refreshment. We have a question for someone who is trying to write some of those.
Well, thank you first very much. I'm so happy to be here and grateful, actually, for pragmatic reasons, because I'll be coordinating a thesis at City College next spring, so it's a lot to learn. Two questions, very quick, talking about elitism and the man in a suit and tie. We are here discussing theses from really great schools, Harvard, Princeton, and the AA, and I'm not at the AA as of yet, but I'm curious, I want to ask perhaps Cristina, because you seem to be showing the most resisting sort of attitude, quoting Chantal Mouffe and conflict and pushing back. Do you have any contacts with smaller schools doing theses, because they're all looking up to you. I have a thesis from GSD as well, so they do look up to us, our doubts, where do we go? And trying to reproduce the models in smaller schools. So I'm curious if there is any initiative of involving other schools, so many at large, in the thesis process. That's one question. And second, for Andrew, I was struck with the use of the word ideology today. I think 10 years ago when I was proposing courses with the title name word ideology, I was discouraged, right? So I'm curious, what is the return of the term, especially today in the instability of the so-called ideological thinking and the singular ideology that can be taught as a thesis?
Okay. So in terms of if we have contact with other schools, in what sense do you mean?
Well, I mean, just exchange, you know. Do you know what they are doing? Because they know what you're doing.
I mean, I think that the exchange that we have with our schools is in terms of the URIs, but I understand that you're proposing something completely different. No, I think that actually will be interesting because every school, as I think that we see here very clearly, it has a different ideological agenda, and therefore the students are trained somehow to look at things completely differently as well. So the easy answer is no, but maybe that could be an interesting proposal. Yeah.
In terms of my use of the word ideology, I guess as I credited Ed Eigen with doing some significant work at the GSD's thesis program, I would have to credit a bunch of others because what I do is sort of built on a platform that has existed for many years and has had many authors. So that word is more credited to Michael Hayes and the work that he does in the history theory curriculum to give students tools, mostly from philosophy in France in the 60s and 70s, to try to uncover the ideological conditions under which they labor and to self-consciously take a position inside of that field. So that's one of Michael's sort of long-term efforts at the GSD, and that finds its way into thesis.
Well, I mean, this is to some extent the return of the repressed because the critique of ideology was thrown out 20 years ago or more, and now somehow it seems like we're kind of back to it, and whether criticality, the critical became a dirty word not too long ago, and so but I read what's going on here now in terms of these new questions that are being posed and this agonistic stance that you're encouraging students to take to be to some extent a kind of reworking of things that happened before, but with a difference. So it's not, I don't think it's, this is an act of nostalgia at all, but the question of the political is very difficult to avoid in our current situation. I don't think that care for the world is the same thing as care for the project, to go back to that. Even with my PhD students in architectural history, the necessity to be passionate, to be absolutely engaged, to be intense about whatever it is that you're working on. You can't spend 3 years of your life or here 1 year of your life working on a project that you're not deeply invested in. But this is a very, multivalent field, and architecture, I mean, there's so many different possibilities. So to try to legislate one way of being political in the world, I think is really reductive. Not to beat the horse to death, I just want to go back to the research and the study one more time and just relate this story of a conference that took place at Museum of Modern Art 18 years ago in 2000 that I organized that was called The Pragmatist Imagination, and one of the dialogues that was staged was between Rem Koolhaas and Cornel West. And so in the course of their conversation, Rem is describing how central research is to his practice, and it's all research, and at a certain point, Cornel West turned to him and said, wouldn't inquiry be a better word than research? And he said, when I hear, this is Cornel, when I hear the word research, I think of R&D, research and development, and a whole military-industrial complex. It's more the facts are talking to you rather than you're inquiring into the facts. And so proposing inquiry as an alternative. I mean, maybe study, but inquiry might be another possibility here. But the idea of intellectual curiosity, intensity, passionate engagement with ideas and a desire to contribute something, whatever the arena, this specific area is that you're passionate about, I think is part of the mix, should be.
There is something about, we have a question there and another one here and another one there, and we have 4 minutes left. Can you pass it to here in the front, please?
Yeah, I have a short question. It sort of follows up on what Joan was talking about in terms of research and study. But has everything been subsumed by search? I mean, I taught for a few years recently, and the students don't do research, they do search. And is there a difference? And how does one take the students out of the world of search and teach them how to research?
I'm going to sort of answer that question maybe, but also speak to Deborah's point. And also something that floated around the previous panel of having, do we actually have anything to teach, And I will come down fairly firmly on the side that what we do is create the conditions for students to teach themselves in a way. Because you can't, you talk about passion, you can tell students to do something you love, but that, that's not going to make them love what they do, It's so in other words, it is a fairly delicate ecology, that's also one of the reasons why I like to turn the attention, more to how things are structured, because you can talk about the big ideas until you're blue in the face, but it really comes down to a very fine-grained sense of how you structure those interactions, whether it's the desk grid or the reviews or whatever. And I think, look, you have a valid point, but again, somebody brought up the question of intellectual curiosity. Joan mentioned it, and that's what you want to cultivate. But again, you can't tell a student, be intellectually curious. That's not going to get you anywhere. You have to steer that ecology and create those conditions where the students themselves are going to express their own intellectual curiosity beyond searching for things.
What is nice about search is just like the first step before research. So it's a prelude, no? I think it's still necessary. Haley.
I just want to say one thing about research or search or inquiry or study in the context of a thesis studio versus in the context of a design studio, which is, Joan, if we go back to your earlier definition, a thesis puts out a provocation or a proposition through which the project tests that. And I think that's the difference, and I'd like to offer the idea of testing. The project should test through iterations or variations or transformations. The project could test it through verifications with experts or consultants. The projects could test it through direct testing with the outside or put into reality. You could do it through calculation. But I'd say that in the context of a thesis studio, the thesis would offer the provocation and the project would test that. So I would say it doesn't have to be about research, it could be about testing. And it's not really a question, it's just
more a comment. We do have a question there, but
I was going to say one thing, I guess, in response to that, which maybe follows from what Stan said. I think one of the things we constantly face is the model of pre-thesis thesis, where 3 credit hours and then however many credit hours you have for the design thesis studio, and the problematic relationship that sets up with the idea, in fact, of I formulate a thesis idea and then I go and execute, or maybe I'm not sure that's what you mean by test, but what I think that suits, I think, certain students more than others. I think a lot of students think that means, oh, I think about things and then I do things. And I think breaking out of that problem, I think, is a huge issue in the pre-thesis semester, and getting students to be making things and drawing things and representing things, I think, is fundamental. And so it would seem to me that it's always a kind of process of iteration between proposition, testing, research, or, well, inquiry, study, and that needs to happen in a much more fluid way. In a way, it's just the strictures of the structures of how we set this up is really an issue, I think.
I mean, I think that there is a very clear distinction as well between doing a thesis as a space of testing, right, and showing how, in fact, it's not about trying to find this ideal answer, but actually a method by which ideas are being brought together, and you're giving to the discipline or to your colleagues a set of parameters or new ways of looking into the world that might allow them to take that knowledge forward, versus demonstrating and proving to the discipline that you are ready to enter the professional world, right? And that's not when you test, is that when you demonstrate, where the rendering is almost like competition ready. And I think there are schools that are interested in testing, and I think that there are schools that are interested in demonstrating. And I think those are probably, for me, two fundamental differences between thesis and schools. There was another question over there. You have the microphone? Yeah. And we will close. One last.
Thank you very much. I'll try and express it quickly. It's really about, I'm glad the question of criticality came up, and the question that I'd like to formulate is, to what degree is the thesis project necessarily critical, or what responsibility does it have to be critical? I think this really relates to the question of thesis now, given the ideological conditions under which we're all working. And I think, this one might frame this in a sort of return of the question of realism versus idealism. I recently heard Graham Harman cite J.G. Ballard saying that, previously artists, one might include architects in that too, formulated fictions, but now, since that everything is a fiction, they must formulate realities. But I think actually the question of the contemporary is neither of those options. It's rather to point out the discontinuities, the ruptures, the incoherences of the kind of prevailing ideological conditions. And so it would seem to me that rather than the projection of an ideally coherent self as a thesis project, that actually it would be the responsibility to critique not only the world, but also the architectural institution, and indeed the institution of thesis itself.
I would like to say something about that. I think that is a great question. I think that one of the beautiful things that thesis does or tries to do in a way, it's to build a voice. So here, for example, we have a whole year in order to make sure the students can build, in this case, like a critical voice. It could be, but anyway, like a voice, in order to avoid somehow to become just a critical workers. And I think that this is a thing that we don't mention, no? But in terms of the amount of education that the students have to get in order to become architects, sometimes the cost, depending the institution as well. I mean, the normal thing that they do afterwards is just go and work in a big firm or whatever. They can pay all these bills too. So this is like this jewel of a space where the students can really understand that whatever they do will have consequences, that actually architecture can have an agency, and we see political agency in architecture in many places, especially after crisis. For example, in Europe after the financial crisis, you go to Portugal, you go to Greece, you go to Spain as well, and you see what people are doing. No? So I would say that that's one of the reasons that I like to believe that we are doing in thesis in a way in general.
I'd just like to return a little bit to the archive. I think the first thesis review I came to the States was in 1966 at Cooper, and the second one was in 1967. And I felt, and going back to what Joan and Paul Slusky were characterizing as designing a house for a fisherman in the Dutch desert, I felt that was just as agonistic, right, as now designing a house for a water diviner in the Dead Sea would be. And in fact, I think the kinds of questions that were raised at Cooper in that moment where it was besieged by no architecture from Berkeley and computerized programming for Cambridge from whence I came were probably the most important questions for a student to be asked at the time. I think that since 2001, where I came to Cooper, I think the most important questions have been expanded and opened. It may be a fault of the way in which the archive is gradually accumulating itself. But somebody said this morning that there were some 400 cases before 2000. There's been about 300 or 400 theses since 2000. And those theses have all dealt with the micro scale of the engagement. I think of a student who was passionate about how to design a very low-cost water filter for the roads of Mexico City and to allow that water filter to collect and redesign the roof at the moment when the torrents came down, all the way through to an extraordinary student who studied desertification in the Mediterranean and then designed a very beautiful, completely organic and self-organized winery for Crete in the place of what was going to be a large-scale tourist development. So all I can say is, having heard everything today and having loved everything I've heard, I love Thesis then, and I love Thesis now.
What is great about last year, and it was fantastic to share a thesis with Igor and Tony, and I'm so happy to be back here, but one of the most, if you want, important moments, at least for me, was when at the end of the reviews, Nader, he came and he said, you know, the drawings and the projects, they just look like Cooper projects. What is interesting is the way in which people understand the power of those drawings and the effects and the agency of those ideas that now are found within those lines and those typologies and those projects have become a bit more powerful. So I think it is true that I don't think none of us here is trying to deny what we have been doing, but we are trying to realize what is that we should be doing. And even just by the way in which you picked some of those projects, right, and you described, I think there is a real sense of urgency to understand what is our role as architects in the construction of society. There are some algorithms out there, better than the ones that Farzin used to actually produce some thesis mission statements, that are going to be able to compute into all the possible hospital typologies and be able to produce things that in some past we would spend 2 months doing, and now actually is going to be done in 2 days. And the essence of what is that architects we bring into the table, I think is constantly being redefined, and is a very important question to ask, and I think thesis, in a certain way, is that the space in which those questions are asked and answered. So I think that hopefully we have something more to add to the question, what is thesis now? I want to thank every one of the participants that was here today in this stage, but more importantly to Michael and Igor for actually organizing this. It was a pleasure. I hope this is the first of many to come. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. No. This is any final comments I make right now may ruin the day. So, which is better, this one or this one? I can't figure it out. That one? All right. I won't try to summarize too much. What I'll try to do more than anything is to thank everybody, to thank the 3 panels in what has been an extraordinary day. On the first panel, the idea that grown-ups would, and actually active thesis students would present their projects is nothing less than brave. In many ways, more brave than any of these other 2 sessions, because to be able to expose yourself in that way is something quite delicate for all of us. I was reminded last night that of my own thesis at RISD, which, for better or for worse, fits into one of those unfortunate categories of the self. As I found myself displaced after the Iranian Revolution in the West, well, I didn't have an identity to begin with because I'm not really Iranian in the first place. And I didn't belong in LA because that's not where I lived. But somehow I understood in the fictive image of the croissant, which at that time was a new phenomena, the possibility that architecture, like food, is not a static phenomena, that it's always under transformation. And in that particular era of typological hybridization and the emerging typologies that were so much in vogue at RISD, I found the possibility of cross-pollination through Western typologies that needed to be infused with, as it were, Iranian or Eastern rituals and practices. In the second session, I found not only a depth of analysis into our culture here at Cooper Union, some humorous, some startling, and some which provoked just a sly smile. But also, I appreciated the analysis of the archive itself, the idea that even the design of the archive and its website and its database are indeed ideological. That how you click on something, how you provide the framework for knowledge is itself a mode of producing new forms of knowledge. I'll comment less on the third one because you've helped to unpack the epistemology of pedagogy itself and how we pretend to teach and how we do teach and how we create a space of learning. So thank you, all three groups, for reminding us what we are so committed to, which beyond anything is a commitment to pedagogy itself, not in its single formulation, but in the multiple variations and iterations that we have to undertake. The presence of John Haydock in all of this is no secret. And so here, more importantly, I'd like to acknowledge Anthony Wiedler and Elizabeth O'Donnell, who preceded me in this position. I don't have to share their anxieties, but I can only imagine how difficult it must have been to follow in the footsteps of a giant whose 30, 40-year presence essentially, if not by intellect, by time, dominates the narrative of history. And much of what we've seen today has to constantly get polarized in that context. But I have the luxury of standing in a position today where we can, in a more balanced way, historicize the pedagogies of John Haydock and do it in a way that is both generous to its time but also acknowledging of the times that came after it. So thank you to Tony and to Elizabeth, not only for extending a school of thought and a culture so unique, but also embedding in it certain questions that could not have been asked in prior generations. I want to acknowledge also Stephen Hillier, who's the director of the archives. Those of you who are not familiar with the archives may not know that it's a multi-headed and multi-pronged part of our institution. It's not only the repository of images and models and documents, but it is an active instrument for making exhibitions, helping in the lecture series and the formulation of larger conversations like this, and in my mind, a central part of our pedagogical project. Our engagement with Harvard is really to invite them here and witness it. Our engagement with other schools is to open up Cooper Union for critique, for further inspection, and for dialogue, and to essentially take an institution which has been known for its monastic closure and effectively bring it into dialogue with the world
but not in the world simply to solve problems, but to imagine new questions. And finally, I'd like to go back to Eva's question about why we do thesis, how we do thesis, and simply say that with all of the difficulties and with all of our own suspicions about why we should do such a thing, this is a resonant question for Cooper Union. I've learned now, after a few years here, that it is in the students' blood here to revolt. If there's a problem, they don't come to you and talk to you about it. They revolt first and put posters on the wall, and then you'll say, we think that's a good idea. And then the whole thing kind of subsides again. But there is a sense of urgency already within the electrons of the students who are effectively alive and sensitized to the world. What is challenging, on the other hand, at Cooper Union is once students are given the platform not only to revolt, but to construct policy or structure or pedagogy out of that revolt, that there's a follow-up. And that moment when you give them the thesis project and you resist on overstructuring it is the moment where they step into a position of responsibility and agency, which I know is dear to you, and to be able to gain the confidence that with all of the successes that this may promise, what's possibly most important in architectural pedagogies is the possibility of a productive failure. Thank you very much.